Hi, everyone. As we kind of wait for people to join, maybe I'll go through some housekeeping rules quickly. And maybe while I do the housekeeping rules, if you can share in the chat where you're joining us from today. Please be reminded that the seminar is being recorded and that the recording will be available on the SCB's Vimeo page within a day or so. And you can, of course, also access all of the previous seminars in the Emerging Issues in Conservation seminar series on the Vimeo page. Please keep your microphones muted, your cameras off for the duration of the seminar. At the end of the seminar, there will be opportunity for questions. And you are welcome at that stage to put up your hand, unmute, and ask your question directly to the speakers. You're also welcome during the seminar to post comments and or questions in the chat. And we will then also deal with those at the end of the presentation. So welcome to what is today the 28th seminar for 2021 in the SCB Emerging Issues in Conservation seminar series. In the series, we feature articles selected by the editors that are recently accepted in early online view or recently published in the 3 SCB journals, those being Conservation Biology, Conservation Letters, and of course, Conservation Science and Practice. Now, my name is Martin Strauss, and I'm hosting tonight. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Environmental Science at the University of South Africa, and I'm also an associate editor at Conservation Science and Practice, and it's in that capacity that I've been organizing the seminar series this year. Joining me today as co-host is Dr. Andrew Carter. Now, Andrew is a senior conservation policy analyst based in the Center for Conservation Innovation at Defenders for Wildlife in Washington, D.C. It is my great pleasure then to introduce you to our speakers for today, Doctors Jacob Phelps and Taufiq Nugraha. I'm maybe going to start with Taufiq. Taufiq, since 2005, is a researcher at the Division of Zoology, Research Center for Biology at the Indonesian Institute of Sciences. His main interest is in comparative biology. He also has a great interest and is actively involved in wildlife management, wildlife forensic, and zoonotic research. He's currently head of the Zoology Experimental Research Group that explores interdisciplinary studies ranging from comparative biology, wildlife bioprospecting, and sustainable use to applied conservation. And Taufiq, thanks for joining us. It's midnight local time for Taufiq, so thank you, Taufiq. And then Jacob. Jacob Phelps is an environmental social scientist with a particular interest in policy, legal, and governance dimensions of tropical biodiversity conservation and sustainable resource management. Trained in geography and natural sciences, he draws on a wide range of methods and approaches. He's a senior lecturer at the Lancaster Environment Centre in the UK, from where he leads the Conservation Governance Lab, and he coordinates conservationlitigation.org. Now today, Jacob and Taufiq is presenting or talking about their paper, Environmental Liability Litigation Could Remedy Biodiversity Loss, and that is currently in early view in Conservation Letters. And with that, Jacob and Taufiq, over to you.
Thank you very much, Martin and Andrew. It's a pleasure to be with you. And of course, I'd like to recognize thank you for your time and also recognize our other co-authors, which represent a really, not only a long list of names, but a really broad range of areas of expertise and broad geography. These are economists, ecologists, applied conservationists, and activists, as well as lawyers in half a dozen different countries. And that, I think, reflects some of the challenge that we've been facing in this paper and in this issue. And indeed, a challenge that is a global challenge, and that's the kind of the Anthropocene reality of kind of often very catastrophic and quite ubiquitous harm across contexts, and indeed, the whole reason that SCB even exists has to do with this idea that we harm systems, and we are often trying to figure out how to respond to that harm. And we, of course, and the 3 SCB journals often deal with these issues. How do we respond when these systems, when this biodiversity is harmed? Do we improve prosecutions or detection? What levers can we use to change behavior, whether they're deterrent, or imprisonment or fines, or perhaps incentives? These are the questions that are often really central to conservation. And that often involves, of course, legal action and courts, and in particular, criminal courts. which are really, in many respects, a last resort for biodiversity, right? Harm has already occurred, and then we're looking for a response, for justice through the criminal justice system. And we've invested, both as academics and governments and NGOs, and huge amounts of resources into this. Example here from Indonesia, increase in criminal prosecutions over the last 10 years, almost, for Indonesia. And what you can see is a significant increase, but in particular, things around illegal logging and illegal wildlife trade really leading the pack in terms of the types of environmental crimes, crimes against biodiversity that are being prosecuted. And these, of course, are resulting in criminal sanctions, things like fines and, of course, imprisonment, right? Taking away people's freedom. And these are important, of course, in terms of justice and deterrence, but what do they actually mean for the harmed system? As conservationists, if an orangutan is harmed, what do we care if the person who harmed that orangutan gets thrown into jail? The sorts of questions that we might have might be about what happens to the harm to the individual, whether it's fungi or plant or animal. What about the impacts on species survival, on ecosystem services, on human use values, and on government agencies that might be losing taxable income, and individuals who might have impacts on their livelihoods or other aspects of their well-being? What do criminal sanctions do for them? They provide something, but I think we can all agree that it's an incomplete response to large-scale harm. What, of course, we need to be thinking about is shifting that towards remedy. How do we fix these sorts of harms? How do we heal the sorts of harms that have occurred? And that's the premise for this paper, looking for legal remedies that allow us to get us as close back to that original system. And so we're arguing not that we don't need deterrence, not that we don't need punishments, but that we also need remedies. And of course, that uses different legal strategies. Criminal law focuses on punishment and deterrence. It isn't meant to heal in the same sorts of ways that liability litigation might be. Now, we are in this paper talking about a broad range of legal systems and jurisdictions. And so one of the challenges that we faced is using language that can be mutually understood across all of these different contexts. So what we're referring to often in this paper is this idea of environmental liability, or what we often call, in the context of biodiversity conservation for our audience, conservation litigation. And that's the idea of using the law to focus not on punishment, but on securing remedies. Now, what does that look like? Well, we are actually, in many contexts, familiar with this sort of legislation, and that's often in the context of oil pollution. And I'd like to highlight what, for me, was kind of the impetus for thinking about these sorts of cases, which was a very famous oil spill in the 1980s in Alaska that many of you may have heard about. This was the Exxon Valdez oil spill. Now, this was an absolutely catastrophic pollution event. And the response to it, though, was important and comparatively novel. It didn't just use criminal law to respond and fines and penalties. But importantly, it also sought to compensate fishers who could no longer fish in that area, right? And were losing income. So it used liability litigation to compensate individuals. But it also used liability litigation to remedy the harm to public goods and services. In this case, it was things like restoration, cleaning up the oil, but also losses and harm to biodiversity over time, as well as the cost of even assessing the environmental damage in the first place. You can see that a fine or imprisoning someone wouldn't address those other types of harm. And in fact, this sort of liability litigation for pollution, particularly catastrophic oil spills, that sort of legislation exists in many countries around the world and has been used, granted not enough, not everywhere, often not in countries in the global south, but it has been practiced. When I was living in Indonesia 5 or 6 years ago, there was a case that came up that was going through the courts, and it had some very important parallels. That was the PT Kalista Alam case. Now, Kalista Alam was a palm oil company that had been illegally clearing and draining peatlands in northern Sumatra, in Aceh province. Absolutely critical biodiversity hotspot. And what was important in this case was that the response wasn't just using criminal law, it was also using environmental liability legislation, just like in the Exxon Valdez. And it said, you don't just, it's not just about imprisonment or about fines, but you must restore this forested site. You must re-wet this peatland. You must manage a forest over an 11-year period. And you must also provide financial compensation to the government for the ecosystem goods and services that you've degraded through your harmful action. Now, knowing about the Exxon Valdez and hearing about this case in Indonesia and being a conservationist working there, I wondered, well, why are we not making polluters pay in the context of biodiversity conservation? Surely there must be something that I'm missing. Maybe it's happening, or maybe the law doesn't allow it. And so that was the impetus for this paper, which, as I mentioned, then involved drawing on legal colleagues in a number of different countries, most especially Indonesia, as well as then conservationists across contexts. And in this paper, we argue that this idea of liability litigation, holding illegal wildlife traders, deforesters, illegal miners, responsible for the harm that they cause and responsible for providing remedies, we're saying that this is, in many contexts, a missing tool for conservation. And so in this paper, we kind of explore three key questions. How do we conceptualize harm when it happens to biodiversity? What sorts of remedies would we want? What would be appropriate in an illegal wildlife trade case? And then what would the law allow? Because of course, as a conservationist without legal training, I know what I want. I know how I see harm, right, for the species and environments in which I work and communities that are affected. But of course, I also, if I want to use legal process, am restrained by all sorts of legal constraints. And so in this paper, it's been a continual dialectic, maybe even a battle would be more appropriate, between conservationists and lawyers, practitioners and academics, talking about what we want and what the law will allow in different contexts. So how do we conceptualize harm? Well, we provide in this paper kind of a course framework that we hope will be applicable across jurisdictions, across country contexts for providing cases. Because if we're preparing cases where you might want to sue an illegal wildlife trader or sue a deforester, and we argue that in order to start with asking for a remedy for that harm that they caused, you first have to characterize the harm that happened. And so we propose that an appropriate approach might be to think about harm on these four axes. Harm to the environment, which is comprised of harm to individuals, endangered species, or a threatened tree, to survival of species, and then to broader ecosystem goods and services. There can also be harms to the state, harms to private individuals, you and me, rural communities that have lost fisheries to illegal fishers. And of course, then also the burdens of undertaking legal action, because taking lawsuits can be really expensive and cumbersome. So we argue that once you have this framework for harm, that then we can start to think about analog remedies. And these are remedies that we as society might demand, and then of course go to the legal systems to seek. Now the question though is, and this has been a really long debate within our group, is what are appropriate remedies for this sort of environmental harm? Well, we can think about ecosystem goods and services and harm to individuals and harm to communities and the state in different ways. You might want to say the market value. Let's say that an illegal orangutan that's illegally traded is worth $100 on the market. You could use that. And indeed, many practitioners, lawyers and judges and so on, kind of prefer this because it's very clear. And we're also familiar with market logic. But of course, we as conservationists know that the market value of an individual is a really poor representation for its actual value. So we might use a default value, let's say $300 per hectare. But of course, we know as conservationists, as ecologists, that depends on what context and what species and what ecosystem and what time of year, right? It's really imperfect. Now, as a community, we also have made huge gains in terms of natural capital valuation. But when it comes to biodiversity, not only are there limitations to natural capital valuation, but we know that we haven't really determined those values, especially at site levels, for decision-making in most contexts. So what we argue in this paper is that instead of focusing on monetary and market values, we should instead be focusing on remedies. So what are the actions that you need to take to fix the harm that was caused? So remedial action might be caring for an injured animal or reforesting a site. And of course, that also includes considerations of restorative justice. You might not just want to reforest, but a community might demand justice in the form of an apology or an educational or cultural program, things that really address the intangible values that we hold for biodiversity and for nature. So we argue that instead of focusing on trying to put a price on nature, we should be focusing on the actions that need to be taken to fix the harm that was caused. And then we can figure out what it might cost to undertake those actions. We argue that this sort of framework is applicable across contexts and actually allowed by many legal systems. And so what are appropriate remedies? Let's say if one orangutan is harmed. Well, it might involve kind of compensation. It might be something financial, but importantly, it's going to be remedial actions to help the species survive in the wild. And importantly, non-financial actions. Again, cultural events, educational events, public apologies that might carry really important social signals that simply slapping a $100 fine on someone might really kind of overlook and even miss the point. Now, as we were working on this project with funding from the UK government through the Illegal Wildlife Trade Challenge Fund, something exciting happened. A case came up in France, and it was a case that was actually using new legislation from France. I think it's legislation that dates only to 2017. And that was legislation that would allow lawsuits against groups like illegal wildlife traders for the harm that they caused. And in this case, it was a case brought forward by a national park that had been suffering illegal fishing in the Mediterranean on the French Riviera, Calanque National Park. This was a case of illegal fishers that were stealing fish from inside, poaching fish from inside the park and selling it to high-end restaurants along the Côte d'Azur. And importantly in this case, the lawsuit was looking to hold not only the illegal fishers, but the restaurants that had illegally purchased that fish liable for the harm they caused and financially and morally responsible for providing remedies. Now, those remedies in some cases were remedial actions, compensation for the costs of improving the protection, the monitoring of that protected area. But in addition, they also were looking for monetary compensation for intangible harms, injuries to the park's mission, to its brand, to its reputation. So things that we would have a really hard time putting a market value on, but which we know were harmed. And of course, these are things that are all too familiar for us as conservationists, which is that we know biodiversity. That's what the whole IPBES science policy platform has often focused on. But they've been really hard to get into our policy platforms to actually have decision-making impacts. We're arguing that the courts are one of the ways in which that could happen. And this Calanque case is a great example. Looking back through the cases, we actually found another case that was of interest. This was a case in the Ramapo indigenous communities land that had been polluted by toxic paint by the Ford Motor Company since the 1950s. Now, a lawsuit held them responsible for cleanup of that site. It cost about $15 million. Also a settlement in which they agreed, there was a negotiation that the Ford Company would pay to establish a medicinal herb garden in the Ramapo Nation's lands. Now, the financial cost of that garden was nothing in comparison with the $15 million that it cost for cleanup. But what we're highlighting in this paper is that we can address these other types of intangible values, right? Place-based values, relational values that can be really important to conservation, to communities, and that the law can provide those. Now, this is the kind of approach that we're promoting in this paper. But one of the things we learned is that the lawyers won't let us get away with as much as we want. So really what we focused on also in this paper was understanding not just what do we as conservationists want, but what will the law allow? And so one of the things that we highlight in this paper is that actually liability litigation laws for the environment exist in a lot of countries. A lot more countries than we expected, because we don't see cases actually actively happening for biodiversity in many places. But DRC, Mexico, Indonesia, China, there's a number of countries, including countries that are really high priority for us as conservationists, that have legislation that would allow these types of cases. And what's interesting is that in many contexts, those laws aren't that old. And what's also interesting is that they're not that old, but they're also not actively being used. We think they're probably not being actively used because, well, a lot of conservationists don't know about this legislation. These cases can be a little bit complex to form, which is part of the reason that in this paper we're trying to simplify them and also share what we've learned about how we might operationalize these. But the other interesting thing that we've learned is that these sorts of often in civil law, liability laws allow for a lot of different types of remedies. Now, if you commit a criminal act and you're going to be fined, laws typically tell us if you kill an elephant, the fine is going to be X amount of rand or dollars, right? Or you might be imprisoned for 6 months to 3 years. The law tells everybody, the person who committed the act, you and me, the judges, the prosecutors, it tells you what the rules are of the game. But when it comes to liability litigation, the rules are often less clear. It basically says if you cause the harm, you should fix the harm. If you break it, you bought it. But it doesn't tell you how to do that math. It doesn't tell you if you should use market value or default value or remedial action or think about restorative justice. But there is one principle that applies in most countries, which is that the plaintiff, the person bringing forward the case, must demonstrate redress. They must demonstrate that harm occurred and that the remedies that they are seeking are proportional, fair, and clear, and science-based. Now, we study these species. We study these ecosystems. We work and live in these communities. We understand this harm and the appropriate remedies. It's incumbent on us to not only bring forward cases, but to support plaintiffs in building that logic so that the remedies that the laws in many countries allow can be substantiated in court. There's something else that's exciting, which is that in many countries, laws don't just allow governments to bring forward cases. They allow you and me to bring forward cases. That's not true in every country, but it's exciting because it means that an NGO or an individual or a rural or indigenous community can potentially sue polluters for the harm they cause and demand remedies. This is important because we recognize that often government agencies aren't taking action for the environment the way we would like to. So this provides a democratization of environmental enforcement in ways that, of course, they're not a silver bullet, but can be really exciting for forwarding environmental remedies. Now, the other thing that we do in this paper is that we talk about the legal constraints, and actually working on this with our legal colleagues. When we finished this, they said, "Congratulations, Jacob, Taufiq, you just suffered through first-year law school." What we do is we highlight all of the different kind of key categories of legal constraints that limit you and me as conservationists from looking for exactly what we want. And so this is almost, let's say, a checklist of considerations that if you've identified the harm to the system or species that you're working on, you've thought about appropriate remedies, you've thought about the science that you can have to bring forward your case. But these are the sorts of legal concepts that we as conservationists need to cover if we want to bring forward a lawsuit that might allow us to achieve remedy. I won't go through all of them, and there are a lot of them. Our hands are tied. But the truth is that through our research and through our experience now with practicing some of these laws on the ground, our hands are a lot less tied than I expected. So what I'd like to I've been talking kind of very broadly. I'd like to pass on to Taufiq to talk a little bit more about an empirical example that we use in the paper to kind of make this stuff a little bit more tangible, a little bit more real. So Taufiq, over to you.
Thanks, Jacob. So as Jacob has mentioned earlier in a more broader scale, in this paper, we also put an example of the Bornean orangutan example on how this our framework can be used. Next slide, please. In the following table illustrates several cases of wildlife trade crime involving orangutans. On all 3 cases, the sentences only ranges between 8 months to 2 years, and imprisonment with additional fine ranging from $300 to $5,000. I know it's not much, but at least they're like a punishment, hopefully to bring the effect and send a strong message to others. But how about the orangutan itself as the victim? Okay, Jacob has told you like the perpetrator will be put in prisons, but how about with the harm that already happened? Despite an increase in criminal prosecution of illegal wildlife trade, the criminal sentences are often low. For example, although we know that the wildlife crime can cause huge harm to many elements, in this case, like orangutan, it has to be taken care, rehabilitated, and hopefully can be released into the wild. and it's costly. And not just that. For example, in the case where one individual orangutan is harmed by an act such as an illegal wildlife trade, the harm can result in actually very large and many different elements. This includes the cost of rehabilitating the individual animals, and also the impact on the ways of human use the species as for culture or science. For your information, like orangutan is one of the species that a lot of foreign researchers come to Indonesia for research. And the third is as a critical endangered species, it also affect and the survival of the species, because removing any number of individual of such a traded species can impact the overall species survival. And the last is the reductions in trust in the government ability to protect this endangered species. If we look at this diverse impact, that may seem like a relatively small case, because involve only one individual actually create a significant harm. Next slide. Civil law usually in Indonesia usually what used is law number 32 2009. Is focused on trying to remedy the harm system. It has responsible parties for providing remedies that can help the harm system recover to the original state. Next slide. Here are an example of type of harm and the proposed remedies. To reduce the number of individuals. The proposed remedies is to undertaking actions to increase the number of wild animals. The burden of carrying, rehabilitating, and confiscates animals. The remedies is a financial payment to the group involved. The reduce of cultural or scientific values. The remedies can be in the form of public apologize or raising awareness through education program. Next slide. In the following table, we try to break down the type of harm and the elements of remedy, and then requested remedies in the case of orangutan. In the paper, we put multiple harm, but in this presentation, we just put two examples that directed toward to the individual. For the harm directed to the individual, the element of remedy is in the form of cost of rescue. In this case, we asked for financial compensation for the rescue team. The cost of long-term care, as we might know, this animal is mostly traded as a baby, since the older individual will be difficult to handle. This individual could spend 6 years in their rehabilitations before it was declared fit for release to the wild. The requested remedy will be in the form of financial compensation for the animal care. We roughly estimate around $18,000 for 6 years. Another element is the cost of reintroductions. After rehabilitations, when this animal is declared fit for release, they will be brought to reintroduction locations. In the great apes, there was a consensus not to release the apes in the location where there were wild population exists. So it has to be bring to different site, to the reintroduction site, where there was historically exists, but at the present time, there were no longer wild populations. And after release, there are also post-release monitoring. The consensus is for 2 years. And the requested remedies is the financial compensation to cover all of these costs, which was estimated around $24,000 and $10,000. Next slide. Another type of harm is to the species survival. The orangutan was reintroduced to new habitats, but in the original habitats of the illegally traded orangutan, one orangutan has missing. Not to mention if it was agreed that for one traded baby orangutan, we lost 2 orangutans, since the mother is usually killed as well. Orangutan has one of the longest winning times, 6 to 7 years, and for Borneo, and up to 9 years for Sumatra. So, what's the effort to make this better? To increase we propose to increase the wild populations. What can we do? One of the actions is habitat reinforcement. The requested remedy can be in the form of cost of reforestations, and it doesn't have to be full, since the perpetrator already pay for the rehabilitation and introduction. In this case, we could ask for 10% of the reforestations of the degraded orangutan habitat over 600 hectares. The area of 600 hectares was estimated from the home range of the female orangutan, since In this case, it's like a baby orangutan. It will be carried by its mother. Next slide. In this project, besides these publications, our team also create a policy brief and a guideline in how to do a civil lawsuit for harm to the threatened species. And all of this material can be accessed at www.conservation-litigations.org. Next slide. As Jacob has mentioned, in the discussion before this seminar, currently there were a civil lawsuit initiated by WALHI, an environment NGO in Indonesia, in the case of orangutan. The civil suit tried to implement our framework with the following remedies requested: financial compensation to enable care, rehabilitation, and release of rescue orangutan; funding of additional patrols and scientific monitoring of the Sumatran orangutan populations in North Sumatra to help recovery and replace animal taken by this zoo; public apologize for the damage caused by to the society; and financial support to develop educational exhibits about illegal wildlife trade and its impact. Next slide. So what next? Next step is to do more socio-legal research, type of harm, remedies, standing procedure, and database of cases. Because with different species, we could also have different formulations, and also training for the prospective plaintiff. And one important thing, also have contact with panel of species experts, since each species will have different calculations, and test cases across jurisdictions with diverse type of harm and remedies. And thank you for attention. Back to you, Jacob.
Thanks very much, Taufiq. It's for us really exciting to see a group like WALHI taking up the framework and starting to apply it in actual litigation. Because indeed, one of the frustrations for us and one of the reasons that as conservationists we're turning to law is because we, are often frustrated that our science isn't always heard, and we can go to policy meetings and we can hold events and side events and write papers and increasingly we're asked to write blogs and newspaper articles and indeed lobby for our science. But one of the tools I think that, again, as conservationists, that many of us have not often explored in many high biodiversity contexts, high biodiversity countries, is using the law to uphold our scientific demands. And the WALHI case really illustrates how, in that case, it was a zoo that was operating illegally, holding critically endangered species without permits and making profit off of it and not having, substandard conditions. And so the question is, what is the harm? And what are the remedies? Throwing someone in jail might be appropriate. Finding someone might be appropriate. But really drilling down to what are the values that we place on biodiversity? What are the remedies that we demand when biodiversity is harmed? And this case illustrates how there's the potential for using the law in broader contexts. And I'm really excited to say that since we published on Early View this paper and brought forward this conservation-litigation.org, we now are talking about cases in Cameroon and in Italy and others in Indonesia where there is legislation in place. There are obviously cases of harm to biodiversity, and there are scientists and potential plaintiffs who are interested in exercising their legal rights. And of course, this is something that I think historically we've often left to lawyers to do this sort of stuff. And I think that that's, of course, great and important, and they have the skills and the experience and the expertise to do that. But again, we are the ones who understand the appropriate harms and remedies and systems and often have evidence of harm and scientific data to support remedies. And so increasingly, I think we would argue that it's incumbent on us to use our science in these sorts of legal fora. And I also want to highlight that on this conservation litigation website, we have a 5-minute animated video that explains kind of the logic behind conservation litigation, recognizing that many of us are supportive of strong environmental enforcement, but aren't deeply familiar with the different legal tools available to us. And so please drop by the website, have a look, conservation-litigation.org. And indeed, if you are a scientist who wants to present evidence at a case in your country, or you have a lawsuit that's appropriate, or you want to collaborate, we're a very, very open and eclectic group and would love to collaborate with academics, practitioners, scientists, and definitely with lawyers. So please get in touch with us. And that's it. Thank you very much. We'd love to hear your thoughts and questions.
Thank you very much, Jacob and Taufiq. That was fascinating. Anybody has any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat window or to just unmute and ask. Anybody so far? I had a few questions, but so maybe I'll throw one of those in first and then we can go around again. Do you have any thoughts on the best way to deal with uncertainty? Obviously, not just in science, but in law, uncertainty has a way of kind of sabotaging cases. Can you show that there was causation, that this person actually did harm the species or the habitat? And if you can show it, there's uncertainty in how you would value that, how you would, remedy that. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is definitely something that is not only kind of an abstract issue, is as soon as you bring it to the court, judges make decisions based on preponderance of evidence. And so it's our job to use our science and our language and our understanding of uncertainty very clearly, but also very carefully. Because the way in which you and I understand uncertainty as scientists is very different than a way in which a judge understands uncertainty. Of course, Andrew, you'll know this better than we do, but if it's a criminal case, there has to be beyond a shadow of a doubt, right? Is kind of the language that we often use in terms of certainty. You committed the criminal act beyond a shadow of a doubt. Typically in environmental liability legislation, this varies across country legislation and context, but typically we have to say 50% plus one. It has to be a preponderance of evidence, which is more than 50% sure that the harm was caused. Now, that's hard. How do I show that removing one orangutan caused impacts on human well-being or caused impacts on species survival? As scientists, we might say, well, we need to have some sort of a complex model. We need to, right? And indeed, for some species, we can come up with a high level, a very complex model to show that. And we've got lots of colleagues who would love to do that. But the reality is, for most species, we can't do that. We don't have the data. And it creates a barrier to justice if we say you have to produce a complex model. So these are some of the things that we really debated a lot in our group. And the kind of approach that we've proposed is that we should think kind of back to tobacco litigation, or even more recently to climate change litigation. Once upon a time, it was really hard to convince a judge that smoking cigarettes and selling cigarettes to babies was a bad idea. But now it's given, right? And we've seen this in opiate litigation in the United States, right? How do we show, what is the certainty? How much bad opium addiction did the Sackler family have to promote before we can prove that they caused public harm? Over time, the burden of proving becomes less. First case, it's probably quite high. But over time, society, and that includes judges and juries who are making decisions, kind of get a little more confident, right? It's not just about showing the science, it's also about what's socially accepted. So now if I tell you that removing a hornbill, a critically endangered hornbill, is going to have impacts on seed dispersal, well, how many seeds? How many hornbills? What types of seeds? We can provide evidence around those things for different species with different levels of certainty. But what we're focusing on here is establishing patterns of interaction with a hope that courts start to learn as they have in other sectors. But importantly, we're trying not to say that removing one hornbill or one orangutan is going to affect species survival by 1% or 30%. What we're saying is actually, in order to keep things simple, we're saying if you killed one orangutan or you removed one hornbill, you replace one. And so instead of trying to have really complex issues around certainty or uncertainty, we can show that you've got an orangutan in a cage that removed an orangutan. And so we're saying it's only appropriate that you should provide remedies that help to increase the population by at least one. And our approach for that is that uncertainty is complex and we don't have data for a lot of species in a lot of countries. So we've tried to come up with something that are things that are principles that are science-based, that conservationists would accept, but honestly, I don't think have often been tested in a courtroom. And Andrew, you and of course future judges and juries will be the decision makers as to whether those sorts of arguments carry not just conservation scientific legs, but also legal legs.
Thank you very much. I also see there's a question from Martin. Do you want to ask that directly, or should I read from the chat?
I'm happy to ask directly. Thank you. Jacob and Taufiq, I was thinking with regards to illegal wildlife trade and poaching. I think generally in the global south, the people who are being caught are really the minions, who often can't afford to put food on the table. While the kingpins of what we often told is of organized crime remains undetected and unknown. So, to kind of, well, what are your thoughts on that? So this kind of litigation seems to be limited in that respect. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how one can proceed?
Taufiq, do you want to take this?
No, Jacob. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I mean, and actually, it's interesting because we've talked about with not only in our group, but also with Indonesian judges who have said, well, we don't want to create more harm to people who are, ostensibly the person selling drugs on the corner, right? While we're neglecting the consumers and also the people, the financiers, the people who are sustaining greatest harm and greatest benefit. Those are often not the ones caught. So one of the caveats that we've had in this whole project and that we make in the paper, and arguably we should have made it stronger, these are not the sort of tools that you use against small scale actors. These are the sorts of tools that you use in cases where you have people who are financiers, organized crime, corporates, repeat offenders. If you have a parking ticket or you commit a criminal act, the law again tells us that the government should always prosecute you in a very standard and predictable way. But when it comes to environmental liability litigation, particularly if it's brought by NGOs, but even by public prosecutors, there's a lot more discretion as to what part of the law we use, right? If you murder someone, you have to, right? There's an expectation that the state is going to bring forward a criminal act. But when it comes to liability litigation, the people who are bringing forward those cases typically have a lot more amplitude as to whether they bring forward cases or not. And particularly if it's individuals or NGOs, they have a lot of amplitude. Is this strategic? Is this person, are we using a hammer to crush an ant, for example? And so in those cases, undoubtedly, and as in the Walhi case, I think it was really clear, it's clear that this is appropriate in certain cases, but not in others. And so I think that that's a really important note about when these tools would and indeed wouldn't be used. And what you described, Martin, is really appropriate because in a case like Indonesia, one of our colleagues, Maribel, who's actually on the call, is doing an analysis with some colleagues of criminal prosecutions. And what we see pretty much across the board is that there's a lot of little actors being prosecuted. But what's also really interesting is what she's noticing, and I could allow, she's noticing that there's lots of little cases, but many of them are suspiciously tied together into what is very clearly not just a little case. There's a criminal network there that has been, we've responded with little criminal prosecutions. There's potential to use a large civil environmental liability litigation act against that criminal network that could draw in those financiers and high-level criminals. But that's simply not what's happening.
Maybe I could add a little bit, Jacob. So like in Indonesia now, we also try to refresh the legislation to increase the fine. So the one of the action is like to try to calculate the price of the fine for each species. But as Jacob said earlier, it's not possible. But the approach that was taken by the government is one of the approaches like from the market price, and then also with added with shadow price and willingness to pay. But yeah, it's okay. It's like for orangutan, you could like have fine up to 600 million rupiah or like $50,000 US. But for like big corporate or like this organized crime, it's just really small money. I mean, like for the crime with elephants, like if people poaching tusk, they're going to have like this big fine, but it's still like a small money for this kind of organized crime. So as So what we propose to the government is like to have this as a complementary, our framework as a complementary to the criminal penalties, which is also now we'll be targeting this this small individual with just to have like more deterrent effect and have the send a strong message. So don't do crime or you will face fine penalties. But in some cases where this like a big corporate, this civil lawsuit can be a complementary as approach to as a remedies.
There's one more potential approach is we could sue a small scale trader, let's say a repeat offender who has no money. We could sue them for $1, but we could also ask for non-financial remedies depending on jurisdiction. Let's say they have to do community service, or they have to apologize, or they have to give public talks in their community. So these non-financial remedies that might be really significant, and they could perhaps send a social signal within the community to the perpetrator, to a few perpetrators, but they don't necessarily have to take a financial signal. The laws in many countries allow us, but I don't think we're doing it yet.
Okay. Does anyone else have a question?
I'd like, I don't know if I can start my video. I'm Maribel Rodriguez. I'm Taufiq's and Jacob's colleague. I would just like to support what Jacob is saying. And we have one example of this in the Kalankan National Park that Jacob was mentioning in his presentation. The plaintiff asked for a lot of remedies, which implied a lot of money. I think in the first instance case, the judge awarded them 500,000 euro. But then this case went to appeal, and the appeal judge considered that this amount of money was not proportional vis-a-vis the economic level of poachers. So the remedies awarded were much less. So judges, indeed, they also consider what is the economic level of poachers. And in this case, the non-financial remedies, as Jacob was saying, is obviously a solution. Thank you.
Thanks, Maribel.
Okay, thank you for that insight. I actually have a question in terms of, I think you've talked a little bit about this, from the larger kind of global organizations, whether they're IUCN, United Nations Environmental Program, or the larger global NGOs. What would you like to see happen at that level? Or would you like to see something happen?
I think that, well, on one hand, a lot of local NGOs and a lot of governments respond to where the money goes. So I think that one is financial support for this sort of litigation. It's not cheap, but I think, especially using the type of strategy that we're proposing, we have the potential to kind of reduce some of the burdens of creating cases and making access to justice more affordable. But I think that funding is a really important area. We're very willing to support criminal enforcement, and there's a lot of money, including from the UK government, going into criminal enforcement of wildlife crimes all over the world. Deploying militaries into protected areas, sending out investigators to support investigations on the ground and then bring evidence to police and government agencies, training of handling of evidence from the US DOJ sends out experts, training for judges. But to date, very little of that looks at liability litigation. It's really about catching the bad guys and punishing them, sticking their nose in it. And again, that's important, but I think that there's a need at that global level to think a little bit more about what our objectives are as an environmental community. And that is probably not to catch little guys and punish them. It's to fix harm. So I think from an international level, there's a need for that sort of signaling. And from groups like Defenders, Andrew, Defenders of Wildlife, I think that there's scope to start perhaps exploring how, legal action in places like the United States and the UK, right? These sorts of tools are increasingly used, there's familiarity, but I think that there's scope to start collaborating with lawyers in other countries who, again, have laws on the books, but haven't really used that type of legislation in their own countries, to start collaborating and saying, what might it look like if we use the thoroughness of the legislation in your country to bring that forward? So I think that there's a leading by example, which has already happened, but I think it's also about sending the clear signal saying that, wait, we would like remedies. We would like you not just to catch bad guys, but also fix harm. And equally then to bring in technical support to help people, again, use the thoroughness of their laws, because in many cases, my sense is that laws have been introduced, but they haven't been used because folks haven't been encouraged to, supported to, trained to, and it's about exploring how that might be done. I don't know, Taufiq, do you have any other thoughts about what sort of global support we might need?
Yeah, I think one of the support, like for the big like IUCN and IUCN or something, is like the support of the expert of the species that could help like to make this calculations of or type of harm to each species, because like on the problem with this framework is like it's tailor-made, so on different species we have to like recalculate, so we don't have like one solution for all. Everything has to be, I mean, like the cost of rehabilitations of orangutan will be different with the cost of rehabilitations of slow loris, for example. And also like recently we also asked like, how about like this, like the singing bird? This is the bird is not protected by law, but it's now like heavily being traded. It's not yet endangered, but can we do something about it? Yeah. So that's kind of a lot of different species and different scenario. We'll also need like support from expert. Like for this bird, we could also like the community. Now we have this phenomenon of like silent forest. Probably the community with the base of cultural base could have this as a preventive in this kind of type of case. So probably that's the addition from me, Jacobs.
Thank you very much. Any other questions?
Yeah, maybe a general kind of one, and that was that based on the altmetrics, you know, the paper is performing quite well. From what one can see on the site, within the top 5% of those that are being ranked. And so I went in and I looked at where responses were from, and it's just by a cursory look, it seemed mostly global north, that people were kind of responding to this and tweeting about it, and potentially news agencies picking up on it. So I was looking at that and I thought, well, I really would have liked a lot more from the global south, this kind of being shared. And so I was wondering what your response was in terms of potentially people contacting you and that kind of thing from the global south in particular, in terms of taking this up and trying to run with it.
Well, I mean, that's great, but also, as you say, it's frustrating, because these are, using these laws are probably it's most important in the global south and in biodiversity hotspots. And I think that for us, one of our challenges, and we've actually been investing a lot of effort, is in reaching out to civil society groups in a number of different countries, and we've had some success. But basically arguing that presenting this and saying we would like to collaborate with you on this. Part of the reason I think that there's probably a preponderance of global north is that there's greater familiarity with these types of tools. The US has a history of liability litigation. There are, it's used not in many contexts, not enough cases, but it's used across the European Union in different contexts, particularly, again, focused on pollution rather than biodiversity conservation. So I think that people perhaps are a little bit more familiar with it to begin with. We have been doing a lot of work with promoting this in Indonesia, where we are receiving, increasing interest from civil society and government agencies. But I think that there's a huge amount of labor that is left to us. Also, I think that, conservation journal readers, by and large, are probably not coming from the legal field. They're probably coming from ecology and maybe in some cases, conservation social science, but probably not from a governance and particularly not from a legal background. And I wouldn't be surprised if there's a good bit of intimidation. And I say that because I know that I was and still am very intimidated by legal matters. But in terms of the way forward, I think for us, it's really about engaging with civil society groups across the Global South in countries where we think the legislation is right and working together to bring forward these types of cases. The barriers, of course, are there's no funding for this sort of thing. Understanding laws in other countries can be really difficult. Finding scientific experts can be really difficult because they're intimidated, because they have never engaged with courtroom action before. And also because everybody's so used to going down a criminal route that selling this liability route is kind of a new concept. But yeah, Martin, you definitely highlight the challenge for us ahead. We have a lot of, I guess, a sales job to do. Hopefully this will help a little bit.
Hopefully, yes. I believe that our legislation does make provision for this kind of thing. But yeah, I'm no legal expert, as I said initially, but it's might certainly be worthwhile investigating that further.
I actually have a call with a South African lawyer early next month to discuss possibilities there, and have been discussing with a South African NGO actually recently. It seems that it may be one of the jurisdictions where this could be really appropriate.
Cool, that's really good news.
Yeah, I will say, as an American lawyer, if you look at environmental litigation generally in our country, it's pushed a lot of things that otherwise would not be pushed. So it's kind of exciting to see the potential in the rest of the world where it hasn't been used quite as heavily.
What sorts of nudges have you seen, Andrew? Like,
Sorry,
what's the role of what sorts of nudges have you seen litigation having?
Well, for example, in Endangered Species Acts, if the government is not designating a species as endangered, getting that protection, you can sue over it. In many cases, we sue, we win, we get that level of protection. Alternately, we can use that to stop them from delisting a species, removing it from the endangered species list when we think it is appropriate for it to stay there. So, unfortunately, United States agencies in charge of this kind of work are dramatically underfunded, so they're behind on everything. So a lot of our lawsuits are just saying, you had a 1 year time limit to do something. It's been 5 years. Do it now, and kind of pushing them to just follow, not even follow deadlines, just do the thing eventually.
Great. Yeah, I think suing governments is a really important and, again, also underexplored instrument in a lot of countries. Yeah.
Definitely. I think we're coming up on the end. Does anybody have any questions?
There's nothing in the chat, so maybe with that, Jacob and Taufiq, thank you very much for your presentation today. I know it's not just a matter of showing up here and just winging it. So thanks also for the time that you put in preparing, and Taufiq for staying up so late. It's almost 1 o'clock where you are in the morning.
Thanks.
And thanks also to Andrew for joining us and assisting with the hosting and for your insights. And
thank you for inviting me.
No, it's an absolute pleasure. And then maybe just a reminder that next week in the same time slot, we have another SEB seminar. So that's on the not next week, sorry, on the 29th, we have another seminar at 1700 GMT. And that is by Christian Messier and Jürgen Bauhaus. And the seminar is on, for the sake of resilience and multifunctionality, let's diversify planted forests. And that is another paper that is available in Conservation Letters. So I hope to see you there. And with that, thank you very much. Thanks, Jacob, Taufiq, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you.